Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The morning air hung heavy with salt and anticipation as Ethan Cummings loaded his blue and white kayak onto the roof rack of his weathered Jeep Wrangler. The sun had barely begun its climb over the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot of Pescadero State Beach. At 29, Ethan had spent the better part of the last decade chasing adventure along the California coastline, but today's excursion felt different. There was a restlessness inside him that he couldn't quite explain, a need to push a little further out, to see what lay beyond the familiar swells and currents he had come to know so well. The forecast called for exceptional conditions: clear skies, light winds, and unusually calm seas for Northern California in late September. Perfect for paddling out to the channel markers that had teased him from the distance on previous trips. Ethan had meticulously planned this solo expedition, studying tide charts and marine forecasts, preparing his gear with the same attention to detail that had served him well throughout his adventures. As he secured the last of the straps holding his kayak in place, he felt his phone vibrate in the pocket of his board shorts. The screen illuminated with his sister Megan's face, her knowing smile frozen in time from their last hiking trip to Big Sur. "Little early for a social call, Meg," Ethan answered, wedging the phone between his ear and shoulder as he tugged on the straps one final time. "Just making sure my little brother hasn't floated away without saying goodbye," Megan replied, the familiar concern barely concealed beneath her teasing tone. "Mom said you were heading out to Pescadero today. Solo trip?" "You know it," Ethan said, scanning the horizon where the dark blue ocean met the lightening sky. "Perfect day for it. Should be back by sunset." "Just promise me you'll stay within the buoys this time," Megan said. "I heard there was a shark sighting near Año Nuevo last week. Some surfer claimed he saw a 15-footer. Ethan chuckled as he climbed into the driver's seat. "Surfers and their fish stories. Probably a sea lion. Besides, I've got my shark repellent bands and whistle. I'll be fine." "That's what your kind always says before becoming chum," Megan retorted, but there was resignation in her voice. She'd long ago accepted her brother's need for these solitary communions with the ocean. "Just check in when you're back on land, okay?" "Will do. Love you, sis." Ethan ended the call and started the Jeep, the familiar rumble of the engine matching, the anticipation building in his chest. The drive to the beach access point took only minutes. Ethan parked in the designated area and began his well-practiced routine of unloading and preparing his kayak. The pre-dawn light had given way to the soft glow of early morning, revealing a coastline shrouded in a thin layer of fog that would burn off within the hour. He pulled his wetsuit on over his board shorts and rash guard, the 5mm neoprene a necessary defense against the cold Pacific waters that rarely climbed above 60 degrees, even in late summer. His kayak, a Wilderness Systems Tsunami 145, was designed for open water touring, its hull streamlined to cut through waves and currents with minimal resistance. Ethan had added his own modifications: additional bungee cords for securing gear, a custom-mounted compass, and waterproof bags containing emergency supplies. Flares, first aid kit, extra energy bars, a marine radio, and a personal locator beacon that he'd never had to use but carried religiously. Around his left wrist, he secured the black rubber bracelet that supposedly emitted an electromagnetic field that deterred sharks, a gift from Megan after he'd mentioned his interest in paddling farther out from shore. Ethan wasn't convinced of its efficacy, but he wore it anyway, partly out of superstition and partly to reassure his sister when she inevitably asked. The beach was deserted as Ethan dragged his kayak across the sand toward the shoreline. A pair of sandpipers darted along the water's edge, their thin legs a blur as they probed the wet sand for breakfast. Further out, a small group of brown pelicans glided in formation just above the water's surface, their prehistoric profiles silhouetted against the brightening sky. Ethan paused at the water's edge, taking a moment to breathe in the scene, to center himself before pushing out into the swells. The ritual was always the same: 3 deep breaths, a silent acknowledgement of the ocean's power, and a promise to respect its unpredictability. His father, a former Coast Guard officer, had instilled in him this reverence for the sea long before he'd lost his battle with lung cancer 5 years ago. "Respect the water, son. James Cummings would say. It doesn't care how strong you are or how well you can swim. It's always stronger. With practiced efficiency, Ethan secured his waterproof bag containing his phone, wallet, and car keys to one of the bungee cords behind his seat, clipped his marine radio to his life vest, and pushed the kayak into the gentle surf. He waded alongside it until he was knee-deep, then smoothly slid into the seat, securing the spray skirt around the cockpit's rim to keep water out. With a few powerful strokes of his carbon fiber paddle, he propelled himself through the small breakers and into the calmer waters beyond. The morning unfolded with the predictable rhythm of paddle strokes and rolling swells. Ethan maintained a steady pace paralleling the coastline for the first hour, passing the familiar landmarks of Pescadero State Beach, the weathered rock formations, the distant cliffs that rose abruptly from the shoreline. The fog had dissipated, revealing a crystalline sky overhead and offering unobstructed views of the coast's rugged beauty. When the sun had climbed higher, warming his back through the wetsuit, Ethan decided it was time to venture farther out. He adjusted his heading, aiming for the channel markers that stood like sentinels about 2 miles offshore. The ocean here was deeper, the watercolor shifting from the teal of the shallows to a deep, almost indigo blue that hinted at the Pacific's true depths. The change in course brought a subtle shift in the swells, no longer pushing him parallel to the shore, but now lifting and dropping his kayak in a gentle, rolling motion. Ethan relaxed into the rhythm, confident in his ability to read the water's movements. He'd spent countless hours in similar conditions, had weathered sudden squalls and unexpected currents. Today's calm seas posed no challenge to his experienced hands. As he approached the first channel marker, a red buoy that bobbed lazily in the gentle swells, Ethan noticed a change in the water. About 50 yards ahead, the surface looked different, smoother, almost glassy compared to the textured surface around him. He slowed his pace, curiosity overtaking his initial caution. In his years of kayaking these waters, he'd witnessed many natural phenomena: bait balls of anchovies churning the surface as they fled predators, upwellings of cold water creating distinct boundaries, even the occasional gathering of harmless jellyfish creating patches of calmer water. What he saw now resembled the first, a possible school of fish creating a disturbance below the surface. Ethan decided to investigate, adjusting his course toward the anomaly. As he drew closer, he noticed something else. Seabirds had begun to gather overhead, their calls carrying across the water as they circled expectantly. It was a sure sign of a feeding event, likely small fish being pushed to the surface by predators below. Jackpot, Ethan murmured to himself, reaching for the waterproof case that held his phone. This was exactly the kind of natural spectacle he sought on these excursions: wild nature, unfolding according to ancient, primal patterns. He paused about 20 yards from the disturbance, watching as the glassy patch began to roil with increasing activity. Small fish, likely anchovies or sardines, broke the surface in silver flashes, creating expanding ripples. The birds grew more frenzied, diving into the water and emerging with wriggling prizes in their beaks. Ethan managed to capture a few photos, zooming in as best he could on the feeding frenzy. He tucked the phone back into its waterproof case, then decided to paddle closer for a better view. The naturalist in him knew that what he was witnessing was a completely natural occurrence. Larger predatory fish, perhaps mackerel or small tuna, herding baitfish toward the surface for easier feeding. What happened next occurred with such stunning swiftness that Ethan's mind struggled to process the sequence of events. One moment, he was gliding toward the disturbance, camera at the ready. The next, the water erupted less than 10 feet from his kayak. A massive form, gray-brown and sleek, breached the surface in a spray of white water, its entire body clearing the surface before crashing back down with a force that sent a wave radiating outward. The kayak rocked violently, nearly capsizing. Before Ethan's instinctive corrective lean stabilized it, his heart hammered against his ribs as his brain finally registered what he had seen: a shark, and not just any shark. The size, coloration, and distinctive shape left no doubt. Carcharodon carcharias, a great white. The apex predator of these waters had been feeding on the baitfish, oblivious to Ethan's approach until the kayak had entered its hunting zone. Holy shit, Ethan breathed, adrenaline flooding his system. The shark had disappeared beneath the surface, but the calm water had been transformed into a turbulent churn of white foam and fleeing fish. The birds scattered, their instincts warning them away from the larger predator that had announced its presence. Training and experience told Ethan to remain calm, to make a careful, deliberate retreat back toward shore. Sudden, panicked movements could attract the shark's attention, potentially triggering its predatory response. He gripped his paddle with white knuckles, trying to control his breathing as he began to back away from the feeding area, keeping his eyes fixed on the water around him. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The surface returned to its normal pattern of small swells, the only evidence of the shark's presence being the absence of fish and birds that had been there moments before. Ethan continued his slow withdrawal, the shoreline now seeming impossibly distant despite being little more than 2 miles away. A dark shadow passed beneath his kayak, so close that he could have reached down and touched it had he been foolish enough to try. The great white was circling back, investigating the unfamiliar object that had interrupted its feeding. Ethan froze, paddle suspended above the water, hardly daring to breathe as the massive predator glided beneath him. From his elevated position, he could see the shark clearly through the crystalline water, at least 15 feet of perfectly evolved hunting machine. Its body was a torpedo of muscle, the distinctive countershading of dark gray above and white below, making it simultaneously visible to Ethan from above and nearly invisible to prey looking up from below. The dorsal fin, temporarily submerged, was as large as a man's torso. The great white completed its circle and began another pass closer this time. Ethan knew the behavior from countless nature documentaries and the marine biology courses he'd taken in college. The shark was investigating using the only sensory tool available to it, its mouth. Great whites, lacking hands or other appendages, often sample unfamiliar objects with an exploratory bite to determine whether they were food or not. "Not today," Ethan muttered, forcing himself into action. He began paddling again, not toward shore but perpendicular to his previous course, hoping to move away from the shark's established hunting ground. The maneuver seemed to work for a moment. The shadow beneath him veered away, disappearing into deeper water. Ethan allowed himself a shallow breath of relief, then resumed his course toward shore, paddling with measured, deliberate strokes that propelled him forward without creating excessive disturbance in the water. He had covered perhaps 50 yards when movement in his peripheral vision caused him to turn his head sharply to the right. The great white was back, no longer swimming beneath the surface, but tracking him with its dorsal fin exposed, the iconic silhouette slicing through the water like a knife. It was moving parallel to his course, maintaining a distance of about 30 feet. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as he watched the fin, trying to gauge the shark's intentions. When it suddenly changed direction, angling toward the kayak, instinct took over. Ethan dug his paddle deep into the water, executing a sharp turn to face the approaching predator. In the world of sharks, running often triggered pursuit. Standing one's ground could sometimes deter an attack. He raised his paddle above his head, making himself appear larger, and slapped it hard against the water's surface, creating noise and disturbance that might confuse or startle the shark. The fin hesitated, then resumed its approach more slowly now. Ethan continued to strike the water, shouting wordlessly as adrenaline and fear overrode his usual calm. The shark circled once more, still closing the distance but more warily now, reacting to the unfamiliar sounds and splashing. For several tense minutes, this strange standoff continued, man brandishing paddle against the ocean's most efficient predator. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fin slipped beneath the surface, leaving Ethan alone once more in the vast blue. He remained frozen in place, paddle still raised, scanning the water for any sign of the shark's dark shape. Minutes passed with no further sightings. The only sounds were Ethan's ragged breathing and the gentle slap of water against the hull of his kayak. Slowly, he lowered his paddle, muscles trembling from the sustained tension and adrenaline dump. He knew better than to assume the danger had passed. Great whites were ambush predators, perfectly capable of disappearing from sight before striking from below. With deliberate movements, Ethan began paddling toward shore again, keeping his head on a swivel, eyes constantly searching the water around him. The once peaceful ocean now seemed filled with potential threats, every shadow a cause for alarm, every ripple potentially signaling the return of the massive predator. He had covered perhaps half the distance to shore when it happened. Without warning, The water beneath the kayak exploded upward as the great white launched itself in a vertical attack, jaws agape, striking the underside of the vessel with a force that sent Ethan airborne. The world spun in a confusion of sky, water, and searing pain as teeth designed for rending flesh grazed his left leg, tearing through his wetsuit and into the muscle beneath. Ethan hit the water hard, the cold shock of immersion momentarily overriding the pain in his leg. Instinct and training warred with blind panic. He needed to surface, to breathe, to find his kayak, to somehow get away from the shark that now had the taste of his blood. Breaking through to air, he gasped and immediately looked for his vessel, spotting it about 10 yards away, overturned but still intact. The water around him began to turn pink with blood from his leg. Ethan knew he had only moments before the shark, driven by its acute sense of smell, would locate the source of the blood and return to investigate. Fighting against the drag of his wetsuit and the paralyzing fear that threatened to overwhelm him, he began swimming toward the kayak, powerful strokes propelling him through the water, despite the searing pain in his leg. He reached the overturned kayak and clung to it, trying to assess his surroundings while catching his breath. The shoreline seemed impossibly far away, a thin line of white sand and dark cliffs beyond the endless expanse of rolling swells. His mind raced through his limited options. He could try to right the kayak and continue toward shore, or he could activate his personal locator beacon and wait for rescue, hoping the shark would not return before help arrived. The decision was made for him when a dark shadow materialized in the water 10 feet away, the great white returning. Its dorsal fin broke the surface, cutting through the water with terrifying purpose. This was no longer investigative behavior. The shark had tasted blood and identified Ethan as prey. With desperate strength, Ethan pulled himself up onto the overturned hull of his kayak, using it as a makeshift raft. The slick surface, designed for moving through water rather than providing a stable platform, made maintaining his position a constant struggle. He clung to the bungee cords that crisscrossed the hull, pressing his body as flat as possible against the fiberglass to lower his center of gravity. From this precarious perch, Ethan watched in horror as the shark began to circle the kayak, its movements more aggressive now, purpose evident in every sinuous motion of its powerful body. The fin disappeared beneath the surface, but the shark's pale underside was clearly visible as it passed beneath the boat, a ghostly presence in the blue depths. The first impact came without warning, a powerful blow from below that nearly dislodged Ethan from his tenuous hold. The shark had rammed the kayak, testing it as it might test a seal or sea lion before committing to an attack. Ethan clung desperately to the bungee cords, his bleeding leg trailing in the water despite his best efforts to keep it elevated. The second impact came seconds later, stronger than the first. The kayak pitched wildly, and Ethan felt his grip slipping. In a desperate bid to maintain his position, he wrapped one arm around a bungee cord and fumbled at his life vest with the other, searching for the pocket that contained his personal locator beacon. His fingers closed around the device, just as the shark struck again, this time catching the edge of the kayak in its jaws. The sound of teeth scraping against fiberglass sent a chill through Ethan's body that had nothing to do with the cold water. He managed to activate the beacon, its small light blinking to indicate that a distress signal was now being transmitted to satellites overhead, which would relay his position to the nearest Coast Guard station. The shark released the kayak and circled again, its behavior growing more frenzied with each pass. Ethan knew he was witnessing a classic predatory pattern. The shark was working itself into a feeding state, becoming more aggressive with each test of its potential prey. His only hope was that the kayak's hard shell and unfamiliar taste would confuse it long enough for help to arrive. The next attack shattered that hope. The great white charged from directly beneath, its massive body propelling it upward with incredible force. Jaws open wide, it struck the center of the kayak where Ethan lay spread-eagled. The impact lifted both man and vessel clear of the water, for a heart-stopping moment before gravity reclaimed them. As they fell back toward the surface, Ethan felt his grip tear free from the bungee cords. He hit the water several feet from the kayak, which landed with a resonant slap that seemed to hang in the air. Disoriented and desperate, he began swimming back toward the vessel, aware that in open water away from any protective structure, he was at his most vulnerable. He never made it. A searing, incomprehensible pain exploded through his left leg as the shark seized it in its jaws. The world narrowed to a tunnel of agony as Ethan was pulled beneath the surface, the predator beginning the characteristic head-shaking motion that great whites use to tear chunks from their prey. The pain was beyond anything Ethan had ever experienced, a white-hot nova that consumed all thought and reason. In that moment of pure animal terror, some ancestral survival instinct took control of Ethan's body. His right hand curled into a fist, and with all the strength fear and adrenaline could provide, he drove it into the shark's eye, one of the few vulnerable points on the armored predator. The impact sent a jarring shock up his arm, but the result was immediate. The shark's jaws relaxed slightly, enough for Ethan to tear his mangled leg free and kick toward the surface with his good leg. Breaking through to air, he gasped a desperate breath, scanning frantically for his kayak. It had drifted several yards away, and the water between was a swirl of his own blood. The shark was nowhere to be seen, but Ethan knew it hadn't gone far. It had released him in surprise, not surrender. With the last reserves of his strength, Ethan swam toward the kayak, each movement sending waves of agony through his ravaged leg. The salt water was both blessing and curse, its natural antibacterial properties helping to clean the wound, even as it intensified the pain beyond bearing. He reached the kayak and clung to it, no longer trying to climb atop its slippery surface, but simply using it as a floating lifeline. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll. His vision had begun to narrow, dark edges creeping in from the periphery. Ethan knew he was in grave danger of losing consciousness, which in these circumstances would mean certain death. The Marine, radio attached to his life vest, had survived the attack, its waterproof case keeping it functional, despite his submersion. With trembling fingers, Ethan unclipped it and pressed the transmit button. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he gasped into the receiver, his voice barely recognizable to his own ears. "This is kayaker Ethan Cummings, approximately 2 miles offshore, from Pescadero State Beach. Shark attack, severe injury, personal locator beacon activated." He released the button, listening for a response through the static. For several long seconds there was nothing, and despair began to settle over him, like a shroud. Then, "This is U.S. Coast Guard Station Golden Gate. We copy your mayday. We have your position from your PLB. Rescue helicopter dispatched. ETA 15 minutes. Can you describe your situation and injuries? Over." The professional, calm voice cut through Ethan's encroaching shock like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. He pressed the transmit button again. Left leg severely injured, bleeding heavily. Great white shark still in area, using overturned kayak as flotation. "Copy that. Keep your radio on and conserve your strength. Help is on the way. We're also notifying vessels in your vicinity to assist if possible." Over. Ethan acknowledged and clipped the radio back to his vest, his movements growing increasingly sluggish as shock deepened its hold. The pain in his leg had begun to recede, replaced by a numbness that he knew was dangerously deceptive. He forced himself to maintain pressure on the wound with one hand while keeping a death grip on the kayak with the other. Time seemed to stretch and distort as Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness. The world reduced to simple primal awareness. The cold water against his skin, the taste of salt on his lips, the rhythmic slap of waves against the kayak's hull. Each time darkness threatened to engulf him completely, he fought his way back to awareness, focusing on the mental image of Megan's face, of his mother waiting for his call, of all the adventures he had yet to experience. The distinctive thump, thump, thump of helicopter rotors penetrated his consciousness like a distant dream. Ethan forced his eyes open, scanning the sky with blurry vision. At first he saw nothing but endless blue and scudding clouds. Then a dark shape appeared on the horizon, growing larger with each passing second. The Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin helicopter approaching from the direction of San Francisco. Relief flooded through him, momentarily overwhelming the pain and shock. He fumbled for the Marine radio again. "Coast Guard, I can see you," he managed, his voice barely audible even to himself. "Roger that, Mr. Cummings. We have visual on your position. Stand by for rescue swimmer deployment." The helicopter approached rapidly, its downwash creating a circle of turbulence on the water's surface as it hovered about 100 feet above Ethan. Through vision that faded in and out of focus, he watched as a figure was lowered from the aircraft on a cable, a rescue swimmer in an orange dry suit, descending toward the water with practiced precision. As the swimmer neared the surface, a new movement caught Ethan's fading attention. A dark shape approaching just beneath the water, its path a direct line toward the point where the rescuer would enter the sea. With the last of his strength, Ethan raised an arm and pointed, trying to shout a warning that emerged as little more than a hoarse whisper. Whether through Ethan's warning or his own observation, the rescue swimmer saw the approaching shark. The cable's descent halted about 10 feet above the water, and through his radio, Ethan heard urgent communications between the swimmer and the aircraft. Moments later, a different figure was being lowered, a metal basket designed for lifting injured victims. It splashed down just feet from Ethan's position, close enough for him to reach without swimming. With the last reserves of his fading strength, he pulled himself toward it, painfully aware that the shark might return at any moment, drawn by the blood trail that continued to spread from his mangled leg. Hands reached down from above, strong arms lifting him into the basket. Ethan caught a glimpse of his rescuer's face, young, determined, focused, before darkness finally claimed him completely, pulling him down into unconsciousness as the basket began its ascent toward the waiting helicopter. When awareness returned, it came in fragments, the rhythmic thump of the helicopter's rotors, the pressure of a tourniquet around his thigh, the sting of an IV needle in his arm. A Coast Guard paramedic leaned over him, mouth moving in words Ethan couldn't hear over the aircraft's noise. An oxygen mask covered his face, the cool flow helping to clear some of the fog from his mind. He tried to speak, to ask about the shark, about his kayak, about anything that would anchor him to reality, but his voice failed him. The paramedic seemed to understand, placing a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder before returning to monitoring his vital signs and adjusting the flow of fluids from an IV bag suspended above. The helicopter banked, changing course, and through the small window Ethan caught a glimpse of the coastline sliding past below, the familiar shape of Half Moon Bay, the distinctive outline of the harbor. They were heading north, likely to one of the trauma centers in San Francisco. The realization brought both relief and a new wave of anxiety, the seriousness of his condition evidenced by their choice of destination. Time compressed and expanded in strange ways as Ethan drifted between consciousness and oblivion. The next clear memory was of being wheeled through sliding doors, bright fluorescent lights passing overhead in a dizzying procession. Voices called out medical terminology that filtered through his awareness without comprehension. Blood pressure numbers, requests for blood products, urgent directions to prepare an operating room. A face appeared above him. Female, middle-aged, eyes sharp with intelligence and concern behind protective glasses. "Mr. Cummings, I'm Dr. Chen. You're at San Francisco General. You've lost a lot of blood and your left leg has severe trauma. We're taking you to surgery right away. Do you understand?" Ethan managed a weak nod, his mouth forming words that didn't seem to emerge as sound. "Don't try to talk," Dr. Chen said, her voice gentler now. "We've given you medication for the pain. Just try to stay calm. We're going to take good care of you." The gurney was moving again, doors swinging open to reveal an operating room, all stainless steel, bright lights, and masked figures moving with practiced efficiency. Someone counted backward from 10, and darkness claimed Ethan once more, this time the artificial oblivion of anesthesia, rather than the dangerous unconsciousness of shock. When he next opened his eyes, the world had changed. The harsh fluorescence of the operating room had been replaced by the softer lighting of a recovery area. The pain in his leg had transformed from the white-hot agony of fresh trauma to a deep throbbing ache that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. A morphine drip beside his bed explained the curious detachment he felt, as if observing his own body from a slight distance. The first coherent thought that formed was a question. Did he still have his leg? With enormous effort, Ethan lifted his head slightly, looking down the length of his body. Relief flooded through him at the sight of a bulky white bandage where his left leg should be not an absence but a presence heavily wrapped and elevated on pillows. "Welcome back," a voice said from beside him. Ethan turned his head to find a nurse adjusting one of the monitors beside his bed. "You're quite the celebrity around here. Not everyone survives an encounter with a great white." "My leg," Ethan managed, his voice a raspy whisper. "Still attached," the nurse confirmed with a smile. "Though it was a close call, Dr. Chen is one of our best vascular surgeons. She managed to repair most of the damage. You've got a lot of recovery ahead, but the prognosis is good." Before Ethan could ask more questions, the door to his room swung open, and Megan rushed in, her face pale with worry but breaking into a relieved smile as she saw him conscious. "You idiot," she said by way of greeting, but there was no heat in the words, only profound relief. She approached the bed, carefully taking his hand between both of hers. "Mom's parking the car. We came as soon as the Coast Guard called." "Sorry about the kayak," Ethan rasped, surprising himself with the non sequitur. Megan gave a strangled laugh that sounded close to a sob. "Only you would worry about sporting equipment after almost becoming shark food." She squeezed his hand gently. "The Coast Guard recovered it, by the way. It's got some impressive teeth marks that are going to make one hell of a conversation." "Peace." Before Ethan could respond, the door opened again and his mother entered, her normally composed features lined with worry and fatigue. She moved to the opposite side of the bed from Megan, bending to press a kiss to Ethan's forehead. "My brave, foolish boy," she murmured, brushing his hair back from his face with gentle fingers. "What am I going to do with you? Ground me?" Ethan suggested, the ghost of his usual humor making a brief appearance through the haze of pain medication. His mother shook her head, a small smile softening her worried expression. "I think the shark beat me to it. You'll be landlocked for a while yet." The reunion was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Chen, who entered with a tablet in hand, reviewing what Ethan assumed were his medical records. "Good to see you awake." "Mr. Cummings," she said, setting the tablet aside. "How's the pain level?" "Manageable," Ethan replied, the word coming easier now as his voice recovered. "What's the damage?" Dr. Chen's expression turned professional but compassionate. "The shark's teeth caused extensive lacerations to your left thigh and calf, with significant muscle damage. You lost a substantial amount of blood, and there was vascular and nerve damage that required surgical repair. The good news is that we were able to save the leg, and with time and physical therapy, you should regain most of its function." "Most?" Ethan echoed, the word hanging in the air like a sentence. "You'll have some permanent limitations," Dr. Chen acknowledged, her honesty gentle but unflinching. "You may always have a limp, and you'll need to be mindful of the leg's reduced strength, but considering the alternative, this is a very positive outcome." Ethan nodded slowly, processing the information. In the fog of pain medication and post-surgical haze, the full implications hadn't yet registered. He was alive, he still had his leg, and according to the doctor, he would walk again. The details of what some permanent limitations actually meant could wait for another day. "When can I go home?" he asked, the question automatic rather than realistic. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "Not for at least a week. We need to monitor for infection, which is a significant risk with marine animal attacks. You'll also need to begin preliminary physical therapy here before we can discharge you. And after that, you're looking at months of outpatient rehabilitation." The timeline stretched before Ethan like an endless road, but he nodded again, accepting the reality of his situation. Dr. Chen made a few notes on her tablet, checked his vital signs, and promised to return later for a more thorough examination once he had rested. After she left, a new visitor arrived, a uniformed Coast Guard officer who introduced himself as Lieutenant Commander Rivera. "Mr. Cummings," he said, approaching the bed with a professional nod to Ethan's mother and sister. "I'm glad to see you recovering. I was the pilot on the helicopter that retrieved you yesterday." "Thank you," Ethan said with genuine gratitude. "I owe you my life." Rivera waved away the thanks. "All in a day's work. But I do need to get a statement from you about the incident for our records if you're up to it, and there are some wildlife officials who'd like to speak with you as well, when you're stronger." With Megan and his mother looking on, Ethan recounted the events of the previous day, the solo kayaking trip, spotting the bait ball, the shark's initial investigation, and finally the attack itself. Rivera took notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details, such as the shark's size, behavior, and the exact location of the encounter. "Based on your description and the bite pattern on your kayak, we're dealing with a great white, approximately 15 to 18 feet in length," Rivera confirmed when Ethan had finished. "Not uncommon in these waters, especially this time of year when they're migrating." "Will there be warnings issued?" Ethan's mother asked, concern evident in her voice, "to prevent this from happening to someone else?" "Standard procedure is to post shark advisories along the affected coastline for 72 hours following a confirmed sighting or incident," Rivera explained. "But it's important to remember that these animals are following their natural migration patterns. The shark has likely moved on already, continuing along its typical route. Ethan nodded, strangely comforted by the thought. Despite what had happened, he harbored no ill will toward the shark. It had been acting according to its nature, investigating an unfamiliar object in its hunting ground, responding to the scent of blood as millions of years of evolution had programmed it to do. "Your story will probably attract some media attention," Rivera warned as he prepared to leave. "Great white attacks, especially ones where the victim survives, tend to make the news. I've instructed hospital security to keep reporters away until you're ready to speak with them, if you choose to at all." After Rivera's departure, exhaustion began to claim Ethan once more. His mother noticed his drooping eyelids and stood, signaling to Megan that it was time to let him rest. "We'll be back in the morning," his mother promised, pressing another kiss to his forehead. "The doctor said they're moving you to a regular room tomorrow if your condition remains stable." Megan squeezed his hand one last time. "Try not to wrestle any more apex predators while we're gone, okay?" Ethan managed a tired smile. No promises. Left alone, Ethan drifted in the hazy space between wakefulness and sleep, his thoughts turning over the events that had brought him here. The memory of the shark's massive form breaching beside his kayak, the primal fear as it circled beneath him, the searing pain of its jaws closing around his leg, all of it replayed in vivid detail, despite the morphine's numbing effect. Yet alongside the terror was a curious sense of wonder. He had encountered one of nature's most perfect predators in its own domain and survived to tell the tale. The experience, for all its trauma, felt somehow profound, a reminder of humanity's place in the natural order, neither separate from nor superior to the wild creatures with whom they shared the planet. With this strange mixture of awe and respect filling his thoughts, Ethan finally surrendered to sleep, his dreams filled with endless blue water and the sinuous movement of a shadow passing beneath. The days that followed established a new rhythm to Ethan's existence, a cycle of medical examinations, dressing changes, physical therapy evaluations, and a steadily decreasing regimen of pain medication. His room filled with flowers, cards, and visitors, colleagues from the environmental consulting firm where he worked, friends from his kayaking club, even his taciturn landlord who gruffly promised to hold his apartment until he was back on his feet. As Lieutenant Commander Rivera had predicted, the media caught wind of the story. Local news stations ran segments on the Pescadero shark attack survivor, showing footage of the Coast Guard helicopter rescue captured by a fishing boat that had been nearby. Wildlife experts appeared on morning shows discussing great white behavior and the increased sightings along the California coast in recent years. Several reporters attempted to reach Ethan for interviews, leaving messages with hospital staff that he largely ignored. The attention made him uncomfortable. He had no desire to sensationalize what had happened or contribute to the already problematic public perception of sharks as mindless man-eaters. On the third day after the surgery, Dr. Chen arrived with a team of nurses to remove the heavy bandaging from Ethan's leg for the first time. He steeled himself for the sight, knowing from the doctor's preliminary descriptions that the damage had been extensive. As the final layer of gauze was peeled away, Ethan got his first look at the aftermath of the attack. A jagged line of black, sutures ran from mid-thigh almost to his knee, with additional shorter lines crossing his calf. The skin around the wounds was discolored and swollen, mottled with bruising that spread in purple-yellow patterns across most of his left leg. "The primary bite was here," Dr. Chen explained, carefully indicating the largest wound without touching it. "The shark's upper teeth penetrated the quadriceps muscle group, while the lower jaw caught your calf. When it shook its head, it created these tearing injuries along the sides." She pointed to the smaller wounds that radiated from the main injury site. "You're extremely fortunate that it released you when it did. A few more seconds and the femoral artery would have been severed." Ethan nodded, strangely detached as he studied what remained of his leg. It was still recognizably a human limb, but forever altered. The smooth contours of muscle now interrupted by puckered lines of stitches, the skin a canvas of trauma that would eventually fade to silvery scars, but never disappear completely. "When can I try walking?" he asked, his eyes still fixed on the wounds. "We'll start tomorrow with partial weight-bearing using a walker," Dr. Chen replied. "But it will be several weeks before you're walking unassisted, and months before you're back to anything approaching your previous activity level." The timeline stretched before Ethan like an endless desert, but he nodded again, accepting it as the price of survival. As the nurses applied fresh, lighter bandages to his leg, he found himself wondering if the shark that had attacked him was still in the area or had continued its migration, unaware of the life it had nearly claimed and permanently altered. That evening, Ethan received an unexpected visitor, a bearded man in his 50s who introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Keller from the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Shark Research Program. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion," Keller said, settling. I entered the chair beside Ethan's bed after receiving permission to enter. "When I heard about your encounter, I thought it might be valuable to get a first-hand account from someone who observed the shark's behavior before, during, and after an attack. Such opportunities are, thankfully, quite rare." Something in the researcher's manner, his obvious respect for both Ethan's experience and for the shark itself, made Ethan receptive to the conversation. Over the next hour, he recounted the events in detail, describing the shark's initial investigative behavior, its reaction to his attempts to deter it, and the final attack sequence. Keller listened attentively, occasionally making notes in a small, leather-bound journal. When Ethan finished, the researcher leaned forward, elbows on his knees, expression thoughtful. "What you've described is consistent with predatory investigation rather than motivated predation," he said. "Great whites don't typically target humans as prey. We're too bony, not enough blubber to be worth the energy expenditure. Most attacks occur because the shark mistakes a human, especially one on a surfboard or kayak, for its preferred prey, seals or sea lions. So I just looked like lunch," Ethan said, finding a grim humor in the situation. "Essentially, yes. From below, your kayak and body created a silhouette similar to a pinniped. The shark investigated, as they typically do, with an exploratory bite. When it realized you weren't its usual fare, it released you. After taking a chunk out of my leg," Ethan added dryly. Keller nodded, acknowledging the point. Unfortunately, even an exploratory bite from a predator with jaws that powerful can cause catastrophic damage to a human. But it's important to understand that the shark wasn't being malicious or aggressive in the way humans conceptualize those terms. It was simply following instinctual behavioral patterns that have evolved over millions of years. The explanation aligned with Ethan's own understanding of shark behavior, reinforcing his lack of animosity toward the creature that had injured him. If anything, the conversation with Keller strengthened his respect for these ancient predators and their essential role in maintaining healthy ocean ecosystems. Before leaving, Keller extended an invitation. "When you're recovered enough for travel, I'd like to invite you to visit our research facility in Monterey. Your experience could be valuable in our ongoing work to understand and protect these magnificent animals." Ethan accepted readily, already looking forward to channeling his experience into something positive. As Keller departed, Ethan felt a sense of purpose beginning to form from the chaos of the past few days, a direction that might give meaning to what had happened beyond mere survival. The following morning brought Ethan's first attempt at bearing weight on his injured leg. With a physical therapist supporting one side and a walker bracing the other, he carefully shifted until his left foot touched the floor. Pain immediately shot up from the wounded limb, sharp and insistent despite the medication he'd been given in preparation for the session. "Easy," the therapist, a compact woman named Sonia, cautioned. "Just let it touch, don't try to put pressure on it yet." Ethan gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort and pain of even this minimal contact. The muscles in his leg, traumatized by the shark's powerful jaws and then further disrupted by the surgical repairs, protested every movement with searing intensity. For several minutes they practiced this simplest of exercises, touching his foot to the floor without putting weight on it, then lifting it again. By the time Sonia helped him back into bed, Ethan was exhausted, his scrubs damp with perspiration, his breath coming in short gasps. "That's enough for today," Sonia announced, making notes on her tablet. "You did well. Tomorrow we'll try again, maybe add a bit more pressure if you're ready." The slow progress of rehabilitation established itself as Ethan's new reality. Days turned into a week, then 2. Each morning brought physical therapy sessions that grew incrementally more demanding, first standing with partial weight on the injured leg, then taking a single step with the support of parallel bars, eventually graduating to short walks down the hospital corridor using a walker. Throughout this period, Ethan's thoughts often returned to the ocean, to the moment of the attack and to the shark itself. He found himself wondering where it was now, whether it continued to patrol the California coastline or had moved on to different hunting grounds. In quiet moments between therapy sessions and visits from family and friends, he researched great white migration patterns on his phone, learning that the shark that attacked him was likely part of the northeastern Pacific population that traveled between Baja California and Alaska in a yearly cycle dictated by feeding and breeding instincts. 3 weeks after the attack, Dr. Chen declared Ethan ready for discharge. His leg had healed enough to switch from inpatient to outpatient care, though he would still need daily physical therapy sessions and regular checkups to monitor his progress. "You're healing remarkably well," she told him during their final examination. "Better than I initially expected, given the extent of the damage. But you need to be patient with yourself. Full recovery will take time, and some limitations may be permanent." On the day of his release, Ethan's mother arrived to drive him to her home in Pacifica, where he would stay during the initial stages of his recovery. The prospect of returning to his second-floor apartment in San Francisco, with its narrow staircase and lack of accessibility features, was simply not feasible yet. As he was wheeled through the hospital corridors toward the exit, a strange mixture of emotions washed over him. Relief at leaving the institutional environment, apprehension about managing his injury in the outside world, and a persistent undercurrent of something like longing when he thought about the ocean he had loved all his life. The drive to Pacifica took them along the coastal highway, offering glimpses of the Pacific between hills and buildings. Ethan found himself scanning the water's surface automatically, searching for the telltale dorsal fin of a great white, though he knew the chance of spotting one from this distance was virtually non-existent. His mother noticed his attention drifting toward the ocean. "Will you go back?" she asked quietly, the question encompassing both the physical return to the water and the psychological return to the activities that had defined so much of his life before the attack. Ethan considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said after a moment, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "Not right away, and maybe not in a kayak at first, but yes, I'll go back." His mother nodded, accepting his answer without protest, though the slight tightening of her hands on the steering wheel betrayed her concern. "Your father would say the same thing," she said finally. "He always believed that facing fears was better than letting them dictate your life." The mention of his father brought a lump to Ethan's throat. James Cummings had been the one to introduce him to the ocean, teaching him to respect its power but never to fear it unduly. What would he have said about this? About his son being attacked by one of the ocean's apex predators? Somehow Ethan knew his father would have understood his determination to return to the water someday. The weeks that followed established yet another new rhythm to Ethan's life. Mornings began with exercises prescribed by his physical therapist, gentle stretches to maintain flexibility in the healing muscles, followed by progressively more challenging movements designed to rebuild strength and mobility. 3 times a week, his mother drove him to outpatient therapy sessions at a rehabilitation center in Daly City, where he worked with Sonia on more intensive exercises under professional supervision. Progress was measured in small victories, walking the length of his mother's living room without his cane, managing the single step down to her back patio without assistance, eventually tackling the 5 stairs to the street level with only the railing for support. Each achievement was hard-won, often accompanied by pain and frustration, but Ethan approached his recovery with the same determination that had once driven him to paddle miles offshore in search of adventure. 6 weeks after the attack, Dr. Chen cleared him to begin water therapy, controlled exercises in a heated pool designed to strengthen muscles without placing stress on the healing tissues. The first time Ethan slid into the pool at the rehabilitation center, he experienced a moment of irrational panic, his body remembering the shock of immersion after falling from his kayak, the vulnerability of being in the water with a predator. He forced himself to breathe through it, focusing on Sonia's calm instructions rather than the memories threatening to overwhelm him. By the 8th week, Ethan had progressed enough to move back to his apartment in San Francisco. The daily routine of exercises continued, now self-directed with weekly check-ins at the rehabilitation center. He returned to work part-time at the environmental consulting firm, grateful for their flexibility in allowing him to work remotely most days, coming into the office only for important meetings. Throughout this period of recovery, Ethan's thoughts continually returned to the shark and the attack. He found himself consuming every piece of information he could find about great whites, their biology, behavior, migration patterns, conservation status. What had begun as an attempt to understand what had happened to him evolved into a genuine fascination with these ancient predators and their crucial role in ocean ecosystems. 3 months after the attack, Ethan took up Dr. Keller's invitation to visit the Monterey Bay Aquarium's shark research facility. His leg was still far from fully healed. He walked with a pronounced limp and required his cane for anything more than short distances, but he felt strong enough for the journey, driven by a curiosity that had only grown stronger during his convalescence. Keller met him at the entrance to the research wing, a separate area from the public aquarium spaces. "You're looking well," the researcher observed, shaking Ethan's hand. "Much better than when I saw you in the hospital." "I feel better," Ethan confirmed. "Still a long way to go, but I'm getting there." Keller led him through a series of laboratories and offices, explaining the various research projects underway, studies of shark migration using satellite tags, analysis of feeding behaviors, conservation efforts aimed at protecting declining shark populations worldwide. The passion with which the scientists spoke about their work resonated with Ethan, reminding him of his own pre-attack enthusiasm for the natural world. The tour culminated in a room dominated by large screens displaying a map of the Pacific Ocean, dotted with colored icons representing tagged sharks whose movements were being tracked in real time. "This is our current great white population along the California coast," Keller explained, gesturing to a cluster of icons near the Farallon Islands. "We've identified over 300 individuals in this region alone, each with distinct markings and behaviors. Could the shark that attacked me be one of them?" Ethan asked, scanning the display with newfound interest. "Possibly," Keller acknowledged. "If it was a mature female in the size range you described, there's a good chance it's one we've documented before. Without photographs or distinctive bite patterns to analyze, we can't be certain. Something about this connection, the possibility that the shark that had nearly killed him was known to these researchers, had a history, perhaps even a designation in their database, struck Ethan as profoundly important. It transformed the creature from a faceless embodiment of terror to an individual animal with its own story, its own place in the complex web of marine life. As the tour concluded, Keller invited Ethan to consider a more formal collaboration. "We're always looking for individuals who can speak about shark encounters from personal experience, but with respect and understanding rather than fear-mongering," he explained. "Your perspective could be valuable in our public education efforts." The offer caught Ethan by surprise, but as he considered it, a sense of rightness settled over him. Here was an opportunity to transform his traumatic experience into something positive, to help others understand these magnificent, misunderstood predators as he had come to understand them. "I'd like that," he said finally. "I think it would do us healing in a way." In the months that followed, Ethan's life took on yet another dimension as he began working with the aquarium's outreach program. Alongside his continuing physical recovery and his gradual return to full-time work, he occasionally spoke at public events, sharing his story with audiences ranging from school groups to conservation organizations. He learned to tell the tale without sensationalism, emphasizing the shark's natural behavior rather than portraying it as a monster. He spoke about the importance of ocean conservation, the threats facing shark populations worldwide, and the statistical rarity of attacks, despite media portrayals to the contrary. 9 months after the attack, Ethan stood on Pescadero State Beach once more, leaning on his cane as he gazed out at the Pacific. His left leg, though healed, would always bear the scars of his encounter, jagged lines tracing the path of the shark's teeth, areas of muscle that had been replaced by scar tissue, nerves that would never fully regenerate. He still walked with a limp that became more pronounced when he was tired, and certain movements remained difficult or impossible. Yet for all that had been lost, Ethan felt he had gained something as well, a deeper understanding of his place in the natural world, a profound respect for the ocean and its inhabitants, even those with the power to harm. The attack had changed him physically and psychologically, but not in the way many might have expected. Instead of fear, it had instilled in him a sense of connection, of belonging to something larger than himself. Beside him on the sand lay a new kayak, smaller and more stable than his previous vessel, modified with additional flotation and safety features. Today would be his first time back on the water since the attack. A short, cautious expedition close to shore, with friends nearby in their own kayaks as a precaution. As he prepared to launch, adjusting his life vest and checking his safety equipment, Ethan felt the expected nervousness, but also a surprising eagerness to reconnect with the element that had been such an important part of his life. The memory of the attack remained vivid, the massive shape breaching beside his kayak, the searing pain as teeth met flesh, the desperate struggle to survive, but it no longer held the power to paralyze him with fear. Pushing the kayak into the gentle surf, Ethan paused for a moment, looking out toward the horizon where sky met ocean in an endless blue expanse. Somewhere out there, the great white that had attacked him continued its ancient pattern of migration, hunting and being hunted, part of the timeless cycle of life in the world's oceans. And here stood Ethan, preparing to re-enter that world, not as a conqueror or even a visitor, but as a participant in the same great cycle, accepting both its beauty and its danger as facets of the same whole. With a deep breath, he climbed into the kayak and pushed off from shore, his paddle cutting through the cool waters of the Pacific as he embarked on a new chapter in his lifelong relationship with the sea. Miles offshore, beyond the sight of land, a great white shark, perhaps the same one, perhaps another, continued its solitary patrol through the depths. Its sleek body, perfectly evolved over millions of years, sliced through the water with effortless power, dorsal fin occasionally breaking the surface as it swam. It had no memory of the man it had encountered months before, no concept of the life it had nearly claimed and forever altered. It simply existed, a necessary predator in an ancient ecosystem, following instincts honed through countless generations of its kind. As the shark disappeared into deeper waters, leaving nothing but expanding ripples to mark its passage, the ocean's surface returned to its deceptive calm, a boundary between worlds that humans like Ethan might visit, but could never truly claim as their own. The sea kept its secrets, its dangers, and its wonders, indifferent to those who ventured upon its surface, yet essential to all life on the planet it had nurtured since time immemorial. In this vast, complex system, both man and shark were merely players, each with their role to fulfill, their paths occasionally crossing in moments of terror or wonder or both. And in those rare, profound intersections of such different worlds, those who survived emerged forever changed, carrying with them not just scars, but also a deeper understanding of their place in the natural order, a wisdom born of blood and fear and ultimately acceptance.